In the summer of 1946, a man stood on a gallows in front of 100,000 people, and Poland made sure he felt every single second of it. Not because they were cruel, but because what he had done was beyond anything a courtroom could fully punish. His name was Arthur Greiser, and the way he died was designed to match the way he had lived. Most people have heard of Goering, of Himmler, of Eichmann, the big names that haunt the history books. But Arthur Greiser, he slipped through the cracks of popular memory, and that's exactly the problem. Because Greiser wasn't just a Nazi official pushing papers from a desk, he was the man who turned an entire region of occupied Poland into a laboratory for ethnic extermination. He called himself a pioneer. His victims called him something they couldn't say out loud, not if they wanted to survive. By the time the war ended, over 400,000 people had been murdered under his direct authority in the Reichsgau Wartheland, the territory he personally governed. That number isn't a statistic. Those were teachers, farmers, children, priests. Real people with names and families, erased because Greiser had ambition and Hitler had trust in him. And when justice finally caught up with Arthur Greiser, the Poles didn't just hang him, they staged his execution, publicly, deliberately, in a way that hadn't been seen in Europe in decades. Stay with me, because what happened on that wooden platform in Poznań is one of the most chilling and historically significant execution stories of the entire post-war era. If you're new to Darkroom Archive, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Now let's go back to where Greiser's story truly begins. Arthur Greiser was born in 1897 in Schroeder, a small Prussian town that would later become part of Poland. He was, by most accounts, an unremarkable young man. He fought in World War I, struggled financially through the Weimar years, and drifted like many men of his generation toward ideology as a life raft. He found the Nazi Party in 1929. And unlike some who joined out of fear or social pressure, Greiser believed deeply, fanatically. He rose quickly through the ranks in Danzig, becoming Senate president, essentially running the city before the war even started. But here's the detail that changes everything about how you understand Greiser. He wasn't waiting for orders. He was competing to be more extreme than the men above him. When Hitler carved out the Wartheland territory from occupied Poland in 1939 and handed it to Greiser, it was like giving a pyromaniac a forest and a match. Greiser saw it as his personal canvas. He immediately began what he called Germanization, the systematic erasure of Polish and Jewish identity from the region. Polish was banned in public, churches were closed. Polish professors, priests, and intellectuals were rounded up and shot in the first weeks, and Greiser wasn't signing memos from a distance. Witnesses later testified that he enjoyed his power. He toured his territory. He watched. He gave speeches about racial destiny while families were being loaded onto trains outside. Here's where history gets darker and more specific. In late 1941, Greiser wrote a letter to Heinrich Himmler. In it, he requested permission to murder 100,000 Jews in his territory. He framed it as a practical matter, a logistical solution. He even noted it would only take 3 to 4 months. Himmler approved. What followed was the establishment of Chełmno, the first Nazi death camp to use gas as its primary killing method. Not gas chambers in a building, gas vans, mobile killing units. Victims were told they were being transported for labor. They were locked in the back of sealed trucks. Carbon monoxide was pumped in as the van drove. By the time the truck reached the forest, everyone inside was dead. Chełmno operated under Greiser's jurisdiction. The paperwork passed through his office. He knew exactly what those vans were doing, and he kept requesting more resources to scale it up. Over 150,000 people were murdered at Chełmno alone, and Greiser never lost a night's sleep over it. Not one documented moment of hesitation, doubt, or remorse. He threw parties at his official residence while his territory ran on slave labor and mass graves. By early 1945, the Soviet advance was unstoppable. Greiser fled west, abandoning the population he had spent years brutalizing. He was captured by American forces in Austria, living under a false identity, hoping to disappear into the chaos of a collapsed Reich. He didn't. Polish authorities formally requested his extradition. The Americans handed him over, and what followed was one of the most significant war crimes trials before the Nuremberg proceedings even concluded. Poznań, June 1946. Greiser stood trial in the very city he had once ruled as a tyrant. The courtroom was packed. Survivors testified. Documents were read aloud, including his own letters, in his own handwriting, requesting permission to kill. And here's the moment that stunned even the prosecutors. Greiser wept. He begged. He claimed he had only followed orders. He wrote a personal letter to Polish President Bierut asking for mercy, describing himself as a family man, a Christian, a man who never wanted any of this. The same man who had written enthusiastic letters about accelerating Jewish deportations was now crying about his grandchildren. The court wasn't moved. He was found guilty on all counts. Sentenced to death, July 21, 1946, Poznań. The Polish authorities made a deliberate, calculated decision. This execution would not happen quietly in a prison yard. It would happen in public, in the place Greiser had dominated, in front of the people he had tried to erase. An estimated 100,000 people gathered at the Cytadella, the old citadel grounds in Poznań. They came from across the region. Survivors, families of the murdered, ordinary citizens who had lived under Greiser's boot for 6 years. The gallows were constructed specifically for this event, high enough for the crowd to see. Now, here is the detail that makes this execution historically unique and deeply disturbing to watch, even in historical footage. A standard judicial hanging, when performed correctly, kills almost instantly. The drop length is calculated by the prisoner's weight to ensure the neck breaks on impact death within seconds. Poland did not use the standard drop. Greiser was subjected to a short drop hanging, also known as a suspension hanging. This method does not break the neck. Instead, the condemned slowly asphyxiates, sometimes over several agonizing minutes. It was a method historically used for criminals deemed unworthy of a quick death. He was led to the platform in front of 100,000 witnesses. There were no last words from the crowd, just silence as the noose was placed. When the trap opened, Greiser did not die quickly. The crowd watched. And according to multiple eyewitness accounts preserved in Polish historical archives, almost no one looked away. It would be easy to look at this execution and debate its ethics. Was it justice, or was it vengeance? Was it humane, or did it cross a line? But here's the context that changes the entire conversation. The people standing in that field in Poznań had watched Greiser personally oversee the murder of their neighbors, their rabbis, their children. They had been banned from speaking their own language in their own streets. They had been classified as subhuman in official Nazi documentation Greiser himself had signed. For them, the slow death on that platform was not cruelty. It was proof that the world had, finally, corrected itself. Polish legal scholar and historian Łukasz Jasinski later wrote that the public nature of the Greiser execution served a function that private justice could never achieve. It gave the community, not just the state, a moment of witnessed accountability. The murderer died in front of the people he had tried to eliminate. There's something almost Shakespearean about that. The tyrant, exposed and powerless, in the exact place he once commanded absolute authority. Arthur Greiser is not taught in most schools outside of Poland. His name doesn't appear in mainstream World War II documentaries the way Himmler's or Eichmann's does, and that absence is dangerous. Because Greiser represents something specific and important: the mid-level true believer. Not the architect at the top, not the reluctant soldier at the bottom. The man in the middle who had genuine power, genuine choice, and chose enthusiastically to become a mass murderer. History is full of Greisers. Men who aren't famous enough to be studied, but whose decisions shaped the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. If we only remember the Hitlers and the Himmlers, we miss the entire ecosystem that made the Holocaust function. Greiser was that ecosystem. He was the soil in which genocide grew. And his execution, messy, public, deliberately prolonged, was Poland's way of making sure that this Greiser, at least, would not be forgotten quietly. 100,000 people stood in Poznań that July morning and watched a man die slowly on a platform he never believed he'd stand on. He had spent 6 years believing he was untouchable, that history was on his side, that the people around him were less than human. In the end, it was 100,000 of those less than human people who stood and watched him go. If this video gave you something, a new piece of history, a new name to remember, a new understanding of how ordinary men become monsters, then share it. Leave a comment with what hit you hardest. And if you're not subscribed to Darkroom Archive yet, now is the time. Because there are more rooms in history that need to be opened